Let me see. Okay. So, obrigado. Thank you for the introduction and invitation to present on hydration strategies for training and competition. A big thank you to Gustavo, who's providing an excellent presentation and sets the scene perfectly for my talk and on my topic. And it's important to note that the topic of fluid replacement has been hotly debated in the literature. So today I'll aim to provide an overview on the topic and share some guidelines based on the research from colleagues and insight from my experiences in practice. So let's begin with the why. Why is drinking important and included in this webinar series? Well, this is my statement, which I modified from a great quote from Syrio Forel, a sword fighter in the books and television series Game of Thrones. And in fact, he says, all men are made of water. Do you know this? If you pierce them, the water leaks out and they die. But this is a slightly modified version in which all athletes are made of water. Do you know this? If you exercise them, the water leaks out. And please, let's be absolutely clear. We want athletes to sweat. We know the physiological consequence of exercise is the generation of heat. And the main mechanism then to dissipate that heat is through sweating. So if an athlete is not sweating, the likelihood is that they are apologies, can you see my video now?
Thank you, Ian. Fantastic.
Apologies, Orlando.
No worries, man.
Yeah, so we want athletes to sweat. And if the athlete is not sweating, the likelihood is they are not working very hard. Now, this slide shows the results from a study led by our colleague, Lindsay Baker, who compiled the sweat rates of hundreds of athletes and found that the mean sweat rate to be approximately 1.2 litres per hour. But please note the range here, with minimum sweat rates recorded at about 0.3 litres per hour and maximal values up to 5 litres plus per hour of exercise. So there is variation in the sweating response. Now, through our research and service with teams, we see that when the same group of athletes are exposed to exercise of the same intensity, duration, and in the same environmental conditions, each athlete will have a unique hydration fingerprint, which includes, but is not limited to, sweat rates, which we've just seen can vary, sweat composition, and specifically the electrolyte content of sodium will dictate the relative salt losses during exercise. The drinking habits, which we will discuss. Fuel needs may also be personalized, but it's beyond the scope of this talk today. But out of all of these, sweat rate is the primary consideration. Why? Because the sweat rate will dictate the relative risk of becoming or losing more or less water. Now, this process of sweating and dehydration, causing a deficit in total body water, will dictate the consequential level of hypohydration experienced, which can be classified as 2% mild, minus 5% of this is a pre-exercise body mass, moderate, and greater or equal to 10% of pre-exercise body mass being severe. Now, it is highly likely that individual athletes will be more or less sensitive to these levels of hypohydration. Nevertheless, as Gustavo alluded to, the available literature suggests that hypohydration, equivalent to 2% of an athlete's body mass losses, are associated with impaired thermoregulation, a decrease in cognitive performance, impaired skill, reduced aerobic capacity, and finally, and importantly for me, an increase in the perception of effort, all of which it is reasonable to suggest are important variables to consider for both training and competition. So what should we do about this? Now, in healthy individuals, the human body is remarkably capable of regulating total body water. The sensation of physiological thirst is stimulated by either a decrease in the amount of water in the blood, also called hypovolemia, or an increase in plasma osmolality, which is the concentration of dissolved particles in the blood. And both these changes occur with hypohydration as a consequence of sweating. The perception of thirst can also be increased or decreased by signals arising from the mouth, the throat, and the stomach. However, other factors unrelated to thirst and hydration can also affect how much fluid an athlete consumes, and these include how much an athlete likes a drink, the availability of the beverage, as well as social and cultural factors. The key point here to consider, and that to reinforce that which Gustavo so eloquently described, is that the athlete will already be hypohydrated when physiological thirst is stimulated. So considering this, we can categorize two main hydration strategies to utilize. The first is drink to thirst, also known as ad libitum drinking. This was recognized by the third International Exercise Associated Hyponatremia Consensus Development Conference, and in principle states that our sensation of thirst is adequate to dictate fluid intake during exercise. The second is planned drinking, as recommended in the consensus statement of the American College of Sports Medicine, and can be defined as drinking a predetermined amount of fluid, and this volume of fluid is determined by knowledge of individual sweat rates. It's important to note here that both guidelines state that athletes should avoid hypohydration 2 to 3% of pre-exercise body mass. Both guidelines recommend that athletes should not accumulate body mass during exercise through fluid intake. And both state they support performance. And as such, this slide attempts to provide a guide as to which plan to follow, because of course it depends. As the duration of exercise exceeds 90 minutes, there is more of a need for a planned drinking versus ad libitum drinking. In addition, as we move from cool to hot environments, again, planned drinking is advised. But this can also depend on the exercise intensity. High intensity prolonged exercise in a cool environment may also require a planned drinking strategy. And this is also linked to the risk of fatigue. A low risk of fatigue, ad libitum drinking is fine. But with a high risk, hydration begins to be combined with fueling strategies, so the ingestion of carbohydrate, so that then an individualized plan is recommended. And finally, for those athletes partaking in exercise for enjoyment, then in drinking to thirst is more than acceptable. However, in my experience, as we shift from participation to performance-orientated goals, then a planned drinking regime is recommended. So let's discuss that performance element. An athlete's performance is a consequence of the completion of sufficient quality and quantity of training to prepare for competition, as well as the successful execution of either physical or technical skills, which for success needs to be superior to the opponents. So the biggest consideration is which sport are we talking about and therefore preparing for. In the majority of sports, the time engaged in training exceeds that spent in competition. The most extreme examples are the endurance sports, but it also applies to combat sports and racket sports. Even in football or soccer, professional football players complete approximately 3 training sessions a week during a 38-week season. This equates to approximately 120 team training sessions during the competitive season, which does not include any self-led or supplementary training. And in these sports where the training intensity and duration fluctuates depending on the goal of the training session, it is possible to periodize and individualize the nutrition and hydration strategy. However, there are a few sports where competition hours may exceed training, especially during the in-season, which perhaps a more consistent, individualized plan is preferential. So please, for the remainder of this talk, please take these guidelines and apply them best to the context of your own sport. For our purpose today, we can define training as the action of undertaking a course of exercise and diet in preparation for a sporting event or competition. In all circumstances, I would encourage and cannot think of a reason why athletes should not commence any training or exercise dehydrated. So this is easy to do. Athletes should be encouraged to drink between 5 and 7 mils of fluid per kilogram of their body mass 3 hours before exercise. And drinking with meals will help the retention and distribution of that water. Now, in our experience, by analysing athletes' urine prior to exercise, it may suggest that hypohydration is common, indicated by a low volume and dark colour of urine. But it's important to note that assessing the urine-specific gravity of the urine is really a better tool to assess whether the athlete is adhering to these pre-exercise hydration guidelines. A low volume of urine suggests that the athlete has either not recovered well from the previous exercise or has not prepared well for the current exercise. Instead, a better indicator to assess an athlete's hydration status is to routinely monitor a combination of factors. So combining urine indices with changes in body mass and sensations of thirst. And if all 3 of these are low, the athlete is very likely to be hypohydrated prior to exercise. Now, It's important to note that I've never remembered a time when we've forced a player to drink. Instead, we advise and we provide recommendations. So all drinks are consumed on a voluntary basis. As practitioners in elite sport, we want to encourage and create environments to promote this voluntary fluid intake in the right quantities and on the right occasions. So how can we best do this? And in my experience, educating players on how to monitor their own hydration status and how their fluid requirements change depending on the exercise and different occasions is the strongest tool for driving voluntary fluid intake. And this slide briefly describes the method that we use to estimate sweat rates. And I will not exhaust this because it's been covered extensively in previous webinars, and we'll provide resources to be downloaded after this the webinar series for you to access and try these methods yourselves. But what we aim to do in a professional environment is repeat this process at different exercise intensities, environmental conditions, and also during different types of exercise. So either on the field or during any supplementary work such as resistance exercise. Then, when we have this information, we can verbally communicate it to the athlete. We can send the results and then also send reminders to their telephones. And this allows us to build up a profile of recommendations. But it's important to back up these recommendations. So practitioners should really consider those factors which promote voluntary fluid intake, such as the proximity of the drink, the opportunity to drink, the flavor of the beverage, the temperature of the beverage, as well as the education of the athlete. But what I'd like us to consider today, out of all these factors, the opportunity to drink is a very important factor. And specifically, athletes should look to replicate competition demands. This is because the opportunity to drink during sports will vary. The best example that I'm most familiar with is soccer, football, where although there is potential to drink during breaks in play, the ingestion of fluid is typically limited to before the match and at halftime. And as such, we should encourage players to follow this pattern and prepare for competition. This will also help the athlete practice their fueling strategy, ensuring that we are meeting the carbohydrate requirements. There is evidence that if athletes practice their carbohydrate and fluid intake, the gut will adapt and athletes will experience improved GI comfort, as well as carbohydrate processing during exercise. It's important to note that habituating the athlete with the degree of hypohydration they will be exposed to during competition will reduce the performance detriments of hypohydration. But for me, the most important element to this preparation is the confidence it provides the athletes, not only in securing a routine prior to and during exercise, but also knowing they are taking ownership and influencing a factor they can control that relates directly to their performance. It's here I'd like to change gears slightly and share with you some of our efforts to evolve the methods which we use to assess athlete hydration. And this process began back in 2013, where Dr. Leitano and I were involved with the CBF, the Brazilian national football team, in their preparations for the Confederations and the World Cup. And we began developing a hydration platform, which primarily focused on monitoring the fluid and carbohydrate intake of the players, and really innovating in the one common denominator in hydration, that is the bottle from which the athletes drink from. Now, these pictures show Orlando and I working on the GX drinks bottle that could monitor the fluid intake in real time at the GSSI lab in 2013. The middle picture, it being used at the World Cup. And the final picture, the top right of your screen, how it's really now being integrated into a wider platform. And this is a picture here of a GX scale, which is located at a Gatorade partner club in the UK. And very soon, technology will help us advance our ability to assess hydration status of our athletes, with the GX cap connected to a GX scale, and very soon a patch that will connect to the athlete's smartphones and devices, which can then integrate with a whole system. And this will provide the patch specifically will provide the athlete information on their sweat rate and sweat electrolyte losses immediately after exercise. So please look out for this availability next year. So in summary, hydration is an area of nutrition science we can easily monitor and influence behavior through recommendations and careful planning. It is also an area of nutrition which we can personalize to the individual athlete based on their unique sweat rates, sweat composition, the training environment, and competition requirements. Therefore, it is important to practice any given hydration strategy, especially when combining with carbohydrate ingestion. Finally, new technologies such as the GX platform will allow us to rapidly monitor the athlete's hydration status during training and competition. And this insight will allow us to more easily link hydration practices to performance or key outcomes that the athlete can relate to, such as power outputs, speeds, distance covered, RPE, first serve percentages, injury. And building this profile over time, this approach gives us more information on individual tolerances and personalized requirements to maintain their health and performance during training and competition. Obrigado. Thank you.